Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me this evening for our online in conversation. Um, my name is Holly, and I am part of the curatorial team at Towner. And yeah, I'm pleased to welcome you to this event with the artist Gerard Byrne and writer Brian Dillon. Gerard Byrne is an artist based in Dublin. His work has widely exhibited internationally, including at Documenta 13. He is professor of film at Stage Schule Frankfurt and most recently co-curated on television Beckett, a definitive survey of Samuel Beckett's 20-year collaboration with SDR television. Gerard's moving image work is also in the Towner collection. And Brian Dillon is an Irish writer based in London. His books include Affinities, Suppose a Sentence, Essayism, and In the Dark Room. His writing has appeared in such publications such as Frieze, Art Review, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The New York Times, and the London Review of Books. As I mentioned, Gerard's work is currently on view at Towner and it will be on view until the 20th of April. So if you haven't, or even if you have had a chance to see it, then hopefully this in conversation will give you a bit of a deeper understanding of the work. But I will now pass over to Brian and Gerard.
Thank you so much, Holly, and welcome everybody to this conversation. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to Gerard, whose work I've known for, I guess it must be about 20 years now, Gerard. And I've written about it. I've contributed to catalogs for Gerard's work. I've shown your work in at least one exhibition, and we've never spoken very much. I knew about this work many years ago, but we've never actually, I think, had a conversation about this film inside an image. Before you all joined us in the audience, we were speaking briefly about some of the things that can go wrong in public conversations and the things that one maybe should do or shouldn't do, the kind of skills and faux pas that you can fall into in these kinds of conversations. And one of those might well be, and I'm springing this on you now, Gerard, I should have warned you before, starting your conversation with a complex quotation from a famous philosopher. But in this case, and I'm going to do it, I'm afraid, in this case, it seems so apt to this beautiful but also conceptually, intellectually, historically fascinating film that I'm going to put this into our minds before we actually get down to talking about the film itself. And it's from Walter Benjamin's essay from 1935, Paris, Capital of the 19th Century. He's talking about the dioramas that arise in Paris, first of all, in the early decades of the 19th century, built and presented to the world by people like Louis Daguerre, one of the pioneers of photography, places where you could go and see a representation of a landscape or a historical event, including battles, quite recent battles. You could go and see the Waterloo or Austerlitz kind of unfolded around you. Benjamin says about this new technology or spectacle, he says, tireless efforts have been made to render the dioramas, by means of technical artifice, the locus of a perfect imitation of nature. People sought to copy the changing time of day in the countryside, the rising of the moon, or the rushing of the waterfall. David, the painter that is, counseled his pupils to draw from nature in their dioramas, while the dioramas strove to produce lifelike transformations in the nature portrayed in them. They foreshadowed via photography the moving picture and the talking picture. So much of what I want to ask you about, Gerard, is in that passage from Benjamin, and it has to do with representation, it has to do with nature, it has to do with technology, and all of that we're going to come to. But I think it's probably really useful and interesting to begin with if you were to just kind of sketch in for us the background to this film, how you came across this particular building, structure, spectacle, and how that project developed?
Yeah, thanks, Brian, and thanks to everybody at Towner for for the interest in the project and for I mean, I'll come back to this. I think it's important to actually talk about the presentation in Towner as well as to talk more generally about the work. Um, but maybe yeah, to start at the beginning. So I am somebody who has always kind of worked a lot with photography and photographic imagery, but I'm not a photographer. I kind of came to photography through art school, and it was always one of several things that I did, but probably always been the kind of central kind of spine. Um, and um, uh, so I kind of worked in and out of photography, usually with the aim of showing works in gallery spaces. At a certain point, I started to work a lot with moving image as well, and even that work has somehow been informed by photography. So that's kind of a very loose kind of idea of who I am. I The specific origin of this project goes back to 2005, probably early February 2005. Actually, hey, 20 years ago. Um, I went to Stockholm to do an artist residency, in Jaspers, which is it's an artist residency program quite well known that's based in Stockholm, and I was kind of privileged enough to be invited to go there for some months. And I arrived in Stockholm and didn't really know many people. Stockholm at the end of January is, at least, I mean, it's kind of a dark place. The weather's pretty inhospitable. It's kind of a hard place to break into at some level as an outsider. Um, and so 20 years ago was kind of pre-smartphones. So, you were really kind of there, and I remember one of the first things I did was I wandered around all of the museums in Stockholm, like using like a guidebook as my way of navigating around the city, was still current at that time. And went to all the big museums. And along the way, I kind of started to pick up some of the more curious places. And one of the curiosities I came across was this space called the Biologiska Museet, which was like a natural history museum. It looked like it was going to be a natural history museum. And it was near, if anybody knows Stockholm as a tourist, they probably know Skansen, which is, I think, the single biggest, most visited tourist attraction in Sweden. And Skansen is basically a folk village, one of these kind of folk villagey places. And it also has a kind of zoo that's attached to it. I've never actually been inside Skansen, but this Biologiska Museum is actually at the gate of Skansen. It's right beside the entrance to Skansen. So a lot of people walk past it. Um, the building itself is quite visually remarkable, though. It's a late 19th century building that was built as a kind of built in the design of kind of folkloric design of a stave church, which is one of these Scandinavian Gothic churches. You see them in Norway. They're completely made of wood, and they have a very particular sort of architectural design. They're very kind of celebrated. And so this was a kind of Victorian era kind of uh, folkloric kind of gesture in a Swedish sense, right? To have this building. It was purpose built as a natural history museum, and it was built to house this diorama. So uh, basically, to cut to the chase, I visited the museum as I say, around this time 20 years ago. Um, I went in on the ground floor. It's very unremarkable, quite dark. Bought my little ticket and went through the turnstile, and it's all very wooden and sort of mahogany-esque. And then you go up a staircase that's a distinctive design. It's actually a double helix staircase, a round staircase. There's an up and a down, and they're entwined. And you go from the ground floor up to the first floor, and then you realize you've entered a kind of a glass, um, a glass enclosure that's circular, um, and it's 2 stories. So there's another story again, and both of these, this enclosure is basically emerges out of the midst of this huge diorama that takes up the whole of the building. The building's about the size of a church, a medium-sized church, or the analogy I always used was a basketball court. So it's quite large for a single diorama. And the diorama is a kind of a presentation of like an idea of like a Nordic landscape or Nordic wilderness. And it's it's contiguous. It runs right around you. It goes from seashore to cliffs to moorland to mountain to forest back to seashore. And so I visited and I took pictures and I looked at it and I kind of marveled at its antique character without overthinking it. And then I walked away and pondered it. And I think maybe when I got the pictures back from the photo lab a few days later, just snapshots, I started to think a bit more about it and realized that there was something quite remarkable about how it looked. And then I started to understand that actually the reason why it had this distinctive look was because the roof was covered in snow. It was Stockholm in February. And I realized that all the light in the diorama was actually had come through this snow, had come through the sky, through the skylight. And that sort of triggered the project actually, because that's when I realized that actually, oh, this building has a very distinctive relationship between inside and outside. And I worked from there. But it took some years before I came back to it actually. So I could go on, but
I wonder if do you know if there's something specific to the design of that diorama that kind of sparked that sense that you've said elsewhere that the building itself, the structure itself was kind of functioning like a camera? Or is that kind of inherent in the diorama as a kind of historical?
per se, I
Yeah.
don't think so. I think it's quite
Mm.
this. I mean, I'm not going to make a claim that this building is unique because I'm not a, there's a, as you pointed to, there's actually a whole history of dioramas. We tend to treat them as sort of anomalies, but actually there's quite a lot of them if you look around. Um, it was a technology of the late 19th century. I like to understand it as a technology, actually, even though we no longer really think of it as a technology. So it was prevalent. They were, it had been adopted in places, and there's quite a few dioramas to look at even now. But I do sense that this was a little bit distinctive, and I think certainly from our perspective, it was a kind of a from our contemporaries' perspective, there was something extremely unique about it in the sense that um, there's no artificial light inside that part of the building, inside the diorama. It's all lit by these. So this Stava church has a pitched roof, with two very large. The roof is quite heavy and it's quite dominant in terms of the architectural structure. It's large roof basically, and basically on either side of these kind of sides, these pitch sides, there's huge skylights that, and then there's in the kind of eaves of the internal roof, there's a lot of uh, basically they're like sails, they're reflectors, like fabric reflectors that reflect the light down from the roof down into the diorama below. So essentially, what you've got is this whole, and there's, as I say, there's no artificial light. Now, the reason why there's no artificial light is I'm still not 100% clear. I did look into the history of the electrification of Stockholm, which began around the time that the diorama was built in 1893. So I'm assuming, because the diorama is not in the very center of the city, I'm presuming that electrification was an issue at the beginning. Uh, but um, but but it's interesting at the same time on other levels that that it was designed in this way. Obviously, with the huge skylights, it was designed to make use of daylight, and um, and it creates basically, as I said, because it's only artificial light. And normally you might not pick up on that. I think it was just specifically because I was there on a day when the roof was covered in snow, and therefore the light had a very kind of uncanny quality. It was incredibly soft, of course, like softer than daylight is, than normal. So it's a kind of a filtered, sort of almost artificial light, but it was actually daylight, just reflected and refracted through a layer of snow. Um, and so basically, it just triggered this set of connections in my head, which was between inside and outside, and the idea of an image inside a chamber, inside a room, and then the idea of light entering that room from another from the sky, from outside. Um, and to me, that was immediately analogous to like the essentials of a camera, which is a camera, as you know, the etymology of the word is that it comes from Italian or Latin, the Latin word for a chamber, a darkened chamber, a room, and so these things are connected in terms of etymology, in terms of like the genesis of the ideas, and so I started to understand that the museum had a relationship with photography, and then I started to look at the way the animals, the way the image itself within the museum was kind of constructed. And that also seemed to have a sort of dialogical relationship with photography, which maybe goes back to your Benjamin quote at the beginning.
Hmm. I
So,
mean, knowing some of what you've said before I saw the film, it's quite striking that we don't see the machinery. That the
mm,
film remains in the world that the diorama creates, the
mm,
natural world that it simulates. And some of the time we're aware of the artifice of that, especially I think when we look at the plants and the kind of fake rock and stuff, or a lot of which seems to have decayed a lot faster than the animals themselves.
yeah.
So there is this sense of a kind of surface of a certain level of artifice. But thinking about how your film, and maybe as we're speaking, we can see some images, or we can turn to those shortly. But thinking about how you film the taxidermied animals and the
Mm,
landscape that the notional landscapes that they're part of. When
mm,
I think about photographs of those kinds of displays, the great Japanese photographer Hiroshi Sugimoto, for example, has
mm,
an extraordinary series of really
yeah,
detailed
yeah.
and white studies of taxidermied animals in
Mm,
museums. Often what you're thinking about there is very obviously to do with death at the most basic level. And to do with decay and the kind of freezing of real life into these static tableaux. But there's something in your film. It's not just the fact that it's a film rather than a series of photographs that seems to me to have to do with movement already. Um,
mm.
and it's there in the kind of careful way that the camera moves through and around these creatures. But there's already, it seems to me, something in the diorama that's to do with movement. Does that seem right? That it's already, as Benjamin says, it's thinking cinematically, not just photographically.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think like the whole project, like Sugimoto obviously is a canonical reference point and is super, it's wonderful work that history. But but I think it also needs to be kind of acknowledged that um like for example, when you look at the Sugimoto photographs, which are beautiful from the beginning, I think he first made them in the 70s in the Natural History Museum in New York. Then you dig a bit deeper and you realize that actually, so for example, my wife is from the States, and her grandfather, who died before she was born, was an artist in New York. and he worked all his life in the Natural History Museum building dioramas. So you realize that even in the like far, far predating Sugimoto, there was this kind of interesting relationship between the diorama and artistic practice and the work of artists and the mechanics of how this technology was kind of put to work. And remarkably, I mean, it seems remarkable now to imagine that like my wife's grandfather had like a full-time permanent and pensionable job making dioramas. Like that's kind of remarkable now to think about. But so that's something of a digression, but I think it provides a type of context. In terms of the question of movement and stasis, that's a dynamic that is very central to the project. Yeah, because it's of course the animals are not presented as carcasses; they're presented as somehow animate, right? In animate positions, right? Uh, there's actually, in fact, quite a few kind of instances of interspecial dynamics, right? There's a moment where something is chasing something else, or there's a hovering hummingbird. There's various kind of moments like that of animation, as you might call. Um, there's so the idea of working with a moving image on one level is about speaking to that kind of tension between the animate and the inanimate, or the perception of animation, right? The perception of life, the perception of movement, perception of of a dynamism. Um, and so that's a kind of central kind of question of the film. Um, And I think the title of the film, in a way, also speaks to that, just this kind of weird, kind of paradoxical inversion of having a film that's made inside an image, right? So the image, by definition, is static, and the film, by definition, seems to have motion, right? It seems to infer motion. Um, of course, the film is made up of static images, but again, there's this kind of idea that the static images kind of appear to be animate through the kind of latency of how our eyes perceive um, film. Um, and so all those kind of questions are in play. That where it actually has there's two very concrete outcomes, I think, that were artistic choices that kind of came out of that set of concerns, which I think might be interesting to an audience to mark. One is I was very committed conceptually to the idea that the film should be a seamless loop. It shouldn't have a beginning and an end. It shouldn't have any detectable edits. So it should feel just continuous, right, and persistent. And that, in a way, is a quality that we would associate in maybe more with the idea of the still image. By the nature of its stillness, it persists, right? Uh, that's kind of the weird secondary meaning of the word still, is that somehow it means it persists, actually. And it doesn't go away. It's still there. And so this persistence of the still image became a kind of concern of the moving image of the film, right? So you've got these kind of entwined, kind of paradoxical, interconnected kind of questions. And then the other thing that was a little bit of a kind of late addition to the kind of idea of the work, but it was a kind of the slightly more Baroque kind of moment in the realization of the work, was the soundtrack, which became a way of, at some level, almost antagonizing the visual, antagonizing this kind of stasis that's marked in the visual, mocking it almost.
I was going to ask you about the soundtrack later, but while
Mhm.
you've raised it, am I right in thinking that the soundtrack is drawn from field recordings of the same animals, the same
Yeah,
birds, the same mammals that we see at more or less the moment that we see them on screen?
yes. Yeah, I mean, basically, there's incredible libraries and repositories of field recordings of bird calls. And actually, the process of making the soundtrack, which I worked on with somebody I've worked on several soundtracks with, this artist Moritz Fair. He's Berlin based, and he's quite an expert in certain types of sound mixing called ambisonics, which is it's a type of spatial sound mixing that was actually developed. It's old technology. It was developed in like the 1950s, I think, by the BBC, very rarely used. Now, of course, it's totally become mainstream because it's widely used in AR productions, VR productions. I mean, not AR, but VR, virtual reality. It's a weird example of technologies kind of becoming animated later in their lives or something. But Morris has worked extensively with this, and so we worked with that type of mixing space, kind of where you're kind of synthetically constructing an idea of an acoustic space, and we worked from libraries of field recordings of the species that are presented. When we had to work, funnily enough, I actually worked with a natural historian to identify the species in the film because I didn't have a list from the museum, even though the director of the museum was extremely knowledgeable about the diorama. I somehow came away without a list of the species involved. So I had to find a natural historian to identify all the species in the film, which was done, and then we used that as the basis of gathering all of these kind of audio recordings from various field libraries. Field recording libraries, and then Moritz mixed it all in a way where sometimes you hear a bird call before the bird becomes present on screen. Sometimes it's kind of an echo, something that you leave as the camera moves, it leaves this call behind. There's sort of there's moments where you're trying to create a kind of a dynamism, where calls speak and reply and these kinds of qualities. This is all the kind of pleasure of the edit, when you get to play around with ideas like that. But yeah, that's more or less how it works.
Right. I mean, the soundtrack is definitely one of the things that adds to that sense of animation, but also, as you now describe it, of movement. The occasionally the sound that's off screen, and then the camera moves to find the source of it, and so on. I want to just take you back, maybe for a moment, to something you said earlier about the justification for the film being a loop, that sense of a kind of seamlessness. That seems, well, from photographs that I've seen of the space itself, that seems to kind of mimic something about the diorama itself, which is you have two viewing levels, and the upper one has in front of it, surrounding it, you see it exactly in this photograph, has a kind of rim of fake landscape, which conceals the lower level and adds this sense that you look down from that elevated position and the landscape simply seamlessly spreads in front of you. It reminded me of that 18th century landscaping phenomenon, the ha-ha, where you have, from the great house, the gardens kind of proceed towards the horizon, and then you have a drop towards the lower level, but that drop is invisible. So one of the things it does is hide, the livestock or machinery of a farming landscape, pretend that it's a natural landscape. That seamlessness seems really important to the diorama to begin with. So the film's kind of mimicking something of that. But I wonder that seems to me to be maybe connected with something that what you find in these kinds of displays, historical displays, 19th century in particular, museum displays and dioramas, which is that frequently there is a question of power, very often colonial power involved, what's being presented to you is a kind of fiction, largely unpeopled, although of
Hmm.
course there were famously, notoriously, dioramas that included examples of indigenous communities and
Yeah.
so on. But there's a kind of fiction of landscape, and you might say landscape is always a fiction to begin with. But I wondered if in the Swedish context,
Hmm.
the title of your film has a title in English, Film Inside an Image, and then and first of all, it has a title in the Sami language of
Hmm.
Sweden. I just
Hmm.
wonder how that maybe plays into the work itself, that particular history and context.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting set of connections. I mean, the title of the work was the titling of the work was an interesting process. I I really like in general when I can come up with titles for works that seem to be generated by the work itself. I don't like to add titles to works that are some that feign some idea of interpretation on my part in relation to the work, um, or to somehow rationalize or apologize somehow for the work through the title. That's something that I really try to avoid. So that my normal way of kind of approaching that question is to, as I say, is to look into the work itself. Most of the works I've made, almost all the works I've made, moving image works, actually every other moving image work I've made, I think, except for this one, has dialogue, and the dialogue becomes like a kind of a repository for potential titles, right? And in terms of its place of language, to find language. With this work, because there's no dialogue, I really had to think a little bit differently about it, and I had just this working title, Film Inside an Image, which I was using as my kind of working kind of title for the work, and it seemed to like loosely describe what the work was trying to do. Um, and so that was the language that was attached to the work as it developed. And then I first thought, oh, well, I should just get somebody to translate that into Swedish for me. And then I started to realize, okay, could do that. But Swedish, I was aware of the fact that Swedish is not the only language that's spoken in that part of the world, especially when you get into the northern part of what's now Sweden, which is the area that the diorama tries to depict. I mean, it actually kind of depicts broader parts of Sweden, but the Nordic wilderness is the term that I often use in relation to this diorama because, of course, it transverses borders between Finland and northern Sweden and Norway, and the area actually I think had a title. Excuse me, it was called Finnmark. It's kind of an antique word. I don't know if it has any currency these days, but it was kind of an antique word that was used for that region. Um, and and of course, the region has historically been populated by numbers of peoples, including most significantly Sami peoples who are migratory and who move across borders and follow. They herd reindeers is the traditional kind of idea of Sami culture, is the core of Sami culture, and I just thought to myself, yeah, well, what about Sami? You know, and this was 2015, 16. I was making the work, so it wasn't made as a kind of as a sort of reaction to the kind of more recent kind of debates around colonial histories. I mean, it was that was stuff that I'm interested in anyway and aware of, and I've always placed a value on. But just in this instance, as I say, it was in some ways just a realization that's Swedish wasn't the only language spoken in the region. Um, it wasn't. So I knew lots of people in Stockholm, so I reached out to people in Stockholm, and I through them I met an artist based in Stockholm, but Sammy, Thomas Cole Bankston is his name, and Thomas was very generous and very enthusiastic about the project, and he basically gave me a title, um, in Sami, in Southern Sami. There's different dialects, uh, so that's the kind of core title of the work. But then we use film inside an image as a kind of working reference, you know.
Okay. I guess there's another kind of seamlessness, or maybe that's the wrong word. I know that you've been using the word kind of bifurcation to describe
Mm,
the relationship, the historical and conceptual and material sort of relationships between different technologies kind of intersecting
mm,
in the same moment. You mentioned earlier your wife's grandfather working on dioramas, and it made me
mm.
think of um, the number of people, for example, who must have been involved in painting film sets. You know,
Oh
the
yeah.
the amount of industrialized
Mm,
artistic skill that would go
mm,
into an industry like that, and the diorama is
mm,
like a kind of precursor of that, in the sense
mm,
that film, until relatively recently, also relied on painters. Um, and much of your work in the past um, has brought together different media, whether it's a kind of overlap between a magazine story turned
mm,
into a kind of film or a kind of TV,
mm,
or a relationship between architectural space and uh, broadcast media, TV,
mm,
radio, and so on. Um, I wonder how you think about that. I mean, it seems that much of that fact of different technologies um, moving at different rates, sometimes falling out of use, as you say, and coming back into use,
mm,
sometimes predicting their successors, which is the kind of one of Walter Benjamin's big ideas. Every technology kind of dreams its successor. Um,
mm,
you've been working with, over the course of your career so far, you've been working through the move from analog to digital, for
mm,
example.
mm,
And I wonder whether you feel as if that shift in recent decades um, is complicated in the same way as the move from the diorama through photography, through cinema,
mm,
that things coincide in the same way, um, kind of nest inside each other in similar ways,
mm,
or whether, as we're the cliched kind of way or simple way of thinking about this that we often have in daily life as much as anything else,
mm,
is that there's just a kind of clean break and we now live in the digital era.
mm,
And I just wonder whether, looking back at this film, which you made a decade ago, how that particular complexity and ambiguity that it's dealing with, how that feels to you now in terms of
mm.
making your own work and living in an even
Yeah,
more digitalized world than it was in 2015 or in 2005 when you first found
yeah.
this diorama.
And it's a very broad question, Brian, but I'll do my best. I like it. Well, one thing it allows me to do in its broadness is it allows me to actually give a nice shout out, as they would say, to Towner, because I think I really want to um, just acknowledge that I think um, I mean, firstly, of course, I'm very appreciative of the fact that Towner is one of the institutions that's acquired the work. Helps me to make more work, obviously, and it helps the people that I work with to, you know, uh, keep going. So that's important in and of itself. But beyond that, it's also, I think, I recognize how it's not easy to install these works. It's a little bit like building a diorama. And so often these works that I've made that are kind of some of them quite complicated to install. I've come to regret or realize or whatever or live with. Um, I am very, very appreciative when an institution uh, puts in the work to install and present one of these works. And so, firstly, I want to say bravo to Towner for doing that. I really, really appreciate it, and I think it's great that they have that ambition and that they're serious like that, and that they're serious about their collection and showing their collection. And I suppose beyond that, to get more into to segue from that into your question, I would say, we use this word. I've been using this word bifurcation, which is actually it sounds like a complicated word. It's actually a very simple word. It's about things splitting, basically. So it's about when you have one thing that develops into two different things, right? The word is widely used in science to talk about like how ideas evolve and how certain kind of theories develop and then are revised and split and evolve. It's connected to the dynamics of evolution. Right? This is the general understanding of the word. The word is interesting to me because I'm interested in when you have this idea of like a technology, and I do think of the diorama as a technology, right? I think it's really important to understand that it was a technology, an imaging technology in its day. It predated moving image, right? So the diorama, as we've kind of inferred in our discussion until now, acted as a kind of proto cinema. It was kind of like a natural history film before there was natural history films, right? Um, it was clearly informed. If you see as you'll see if you see the work in Towner, you realize that the poses of the animals have a sort of proto photographic quality. I think I was saying this to you when we chatted the other day, Brian, that in 1893, it was really the very beginnings of natural history photography, let alone like moving image. Um, in fact, it wasn't really possible to shoot still images of animals, wild animals, in 1893 because cameras were big and heavy. The resolution of film was too low. You couldn't get close enough to the animals. The film was too slow in terms of how it responded to light. Everything would be blurry. It just technically wasn't possible to photograph animals really in the wild in 1893. But the desire was there to do it. And so this museum in a way speaks to that desire in terms of like we can't actually photograph the animals mid-flight or mid-pounce or defending themselves, but we can, using taxidermy and using the diorama, we can kind of mimic that. We can kind of imagine that. We can somehow bring it to life. And so to take that back to the idea of bifurcation, what's interesting to me is it's like you have these ideas and these desires and these technologies that are entwined, right? The technologies are developed to satiate desire, right? Technology is driven by desire, right? Um, and and then you have moments where, oh, the technology goes in another direction. It bifurcates, it splits off, or the idea or the desire goes in another direction. These things split somehow. And then you're left with a remainder. You're left with something that was left behind. Um, I use the word you're left with an alternative, which is the choice that wasn't taken, is the alternative, right? The classic example is like Betamax, right? With video, people always talk about that. There was VHS and there was Betamax, and they were competing technologies, and Betamax was more popular, and then somehow VHS became more popular than Betamax. That was the classic analogy that was used. But whatever about that, the point is like you have something that was left behind. You have something that was an alternative approach that was kind of left behind. And the diorama in Stockholm is a sort of very interesting artifact in that sense that speaks to like where we've come from, what we wanted at a certain point, what we chose, and what we ended up with, right? And that in a way brings us up to today. And I think it is one of the concerns, one of the ideas that's kind of threaded through a lot of my work, uh, these ideas of bifurcation as I've just characterized it.
I think it's probably time for us in a moment to see if the audience has any questions or comments. So I'm just going to point people to the Q&A icon down the bottom. If you have a question for Gerard, just use that. And I think actually, I think we have one in the chat. If you put your questions in the chat rather than the Q&A, that is also totally fine because I can see both. So the first question is from Emily Med, who asks, do you usually work with the same crew members for your moving image works?
Good question. I try to actually because you just got people you work well with. You know, I have a cinematographer who's from Belfast, Damien Elliott, and I just love working with Damien. He's just incredibly dedicated, and I think he likes working with me, and he goes out of his way to help me with my projects. There's never enough budget. There's always like it's always a freebie almost from him, but he's always up for it. And with this project, actually, he did a huge amount of work because something that we haven't even really touched on is that this was an incredibly technical film to make. It looks, as I say, like a seamless film with no edits. There's several edits, but they're digitally patched together through his efforts and through other CGI people. Because basically that diorama, which the camera moves around in, you couldn't use a crane in it because there's overhanging trees and branches and stuff like that. The topography that you see in the film is not all solid. A lot of it is hollow, so you can't really walk on a lot of it. It's very sort of tricky to move through the space. We have to use a very specialized kind of camera setup with what's called a steady cam, which is a way of sort of making the camera hover. Um, it was extremely technical, actually, the production of it. And then Moritz Fair, who did the sound, as I said, I worked on several projects with Moritz and also wonderful. So yeah, I try to work with the same people, but it's always very small crews, and then it also depends on where you're working. You always get a lot of people locally to wherever you're filming, and you know,
Great. Thanks. There's a question from Noel Collins. Thank you for making this mesmerizing work. It's interesting to think about how natural light falling on the diorama was such an integral part of the architecture, design, and experience of the museum.
Mhm.
Can you return to the idea of the film's presentation, back projecting the film and presenting it within a more sculptural structure?
Mm. Good question, and something that we haven't really addressed very much actually in the talk so far. Uh, yeah, I mean, I suppose that connects more to my own kind of way of working with gallery spaces and my own way of handling, let's say, films in a gallery space. And I don't really, even though I work a lot with moving image, I sort of separate my use of moving image from the sort of standard kind of modes of presentation of most filmmakers. I suppose again, I'm choosing the kind of the almost the alternative approach, right? The kind of the gallery as opposed to the cinema, we'll say, right? And so I do like to think of images as physical things, as very, very physical. And I'm interested in kind of underscoring that in terms of how the work is presented. So I'm I'm attracted to ideas like freestanding screen, for example, rather than something that's projected onto a wall. So the screen kind of physicalizes the image in one level. The back projection is also interesting. That was the first time I'd worked with back projection. So the projector's behind the screen, just so if people aren't not familiar with that term. So instead of the projector being kind of above the heads of the audience, projecting in the same direction as the audience is looking onto a screen, and then the image is reflected back off that screen to the audience. With a back projection or a rear projection, the projector's on the opposite side of the screen to the audience, and it projects onto the screen, which is a material that's translucent, and then the audience view the image from the opposite side. It's generally actually, again, another slightly anachronistic way of working. I mean, it's widely used, actually. It was widely used, for example, in early cinema, like when you talked about special effects, back projection was a way of kind of creating, it was kind of like green screen, or before there was green screen, it was a way of adding backgrounds. And so again, a slightly archaic technology, a slightly anachronistic technology. But I think what I like about it in this sense is that in the context of this work is that um, the it just asserts the idea of kind of it's just a type of reality somehow to the image, because it's don't you see it as a, yeah, I don't know, it's actually quite hard to describe without getting really bogged down. I think it has a different quality, is all I can say, than a front projection. I think for viewers, and I don't mean that necessarily in an aesthetic sense, I mean it in a kind of cognitive sense. I think as viewers, when you walk into a cinema or into a gallery space and there's a projector above your head or behind you, unconsciously you register that, and you register the geometry of what you're looking at and how it's configured and all of this. Whereas with and likewise, when you've got a hidden source, which is what is the case with the rear projection, I think unconsciously you also register that, and that creates a different experience.
There's another question about the installation of the work and its kind of presence at Towner, from Alison Hayes, who says, "I love the installation of your piece, how it takes up so much of the room and how it invites us to perambulate around it. How does the setting there differ from other settings it's been shown in, and how do you feel about the viewer being directed into such a small area to watch the film?"
I it's a good question. It's a legitimate question. It's again, it goes back a little bit to what I just talked about, which is one of the. Uh, it's not easy to install a work like this. As I've just described, why I've just eulogized as to the kind of my preferences for back projection or rear projection. One of the real concrete downsides of rear projection is it's space hungry. You need to allow space, not only for an audience, but you also need to allow space for the projector on the other side of the screen. So in fact, you need sort of double the space that you would need if you did a standard rear projection. So I completely appreciate. I mean, I haven't actually seen the installation in town or directly myself, but I was very involved with the planning. They were very happy to have my input, and I was very happy to give it. So I have a good sense of how it works in the space. And I can see that it's a space hungry installation. It was always going to be difficult to fit it into the gallery space. I'm glad that we stuck it out and we made it work. Um, I see where Alison is coming from, and I think that that's one of the kind of one of the pinch points that you're trying to figure out, right? Because you want to retain the important qualities of the work, which is this rear projection, and at the same time, you want to be able to show it, you know? So you have to make it work.
There's another question here from Sharon McGill. "I'm interested to know how you see your work in relation to climate change. The diorama presents a landscape that could be described as a snapshot in time, but of a landscape we know now is changing beyond our control and beyond the control of the Sami people.
Mm.
What do you think?"
I think it's again, very, very prescient question. Um, I only can give a very broad answer, which is maybe appropriate to the nature of that concern, because it's such a broad concern. It doesn't go away no matter where you are in the world. Um, I think climate change hasn't been something that's been a very direct, specific motif, you could say, or like interests, explicit interest in terms of works I've made. Um, which doesn't mean that it's not really, really important to me. And I think that I think in terms of, as the questioner said, it is interesting to think about whatever about my interest as an artist, and I'm deeply committed to the importance of climate change on a political level, just as a person. But in terms of going back to the specifics of the work and the specifics of the Biologiska Museum and the diorama, yeah, I can only agree. It's interesting to think about it as a kind of image of a space, and you really wonder what's that space like now, or what, or yeah, how do we understand it? I mean, of course, it's a classic 19th century projection of, as you say, a kind of peopleless kind of untouched natural kind of terrain, and it's not like that anymore, tragically. Um, but I guess it also speaks to the fact that even in the 19th century, like there's a long history of us inventing ideas of the world, and that's also kind of, I think that continues for bad and maybe for good as well. I don't know. Sorry, it's a very roundabout answer. It's a good question and something that I need to think more about, actually.
There's one more question, which, looking at time, might be our last,
Hmm.
from Dr. Louise Parso. I saw the film in an image about 10 days ago and loved it. As a keen bird watcher, I was drawn into the birds and animals by the sensitive pace and focusing on particular aspects of wildlife behavior.
Hmm.
Two examples are the blood spot on a gull's beak and the slow reveal of hooded crows destroying an egg. I love the
Hmm.
cheeky kingfishers as well, who really got into the behavioral aspects of the taxidermy and captured the movement of the inanimate objects and
Hmm.
reflected
Hmm.
them. Oh, sorry, this is a question. Who really got into the behavioral aspects of the taxidermy and captured the movement of the inanimate objects and reflected them as they are in real life? I'm glad that this exhibition has been captured for posterity in a sensitive way.
Yeah, I mean, I think I read it as a kind of comment rather than a question, and I think yeah, I think it's interesting. I think, you know, I'm not a bird watcher, or a naturalist, but of course, I'm interested in this stuff broadly. I do have bird watchers in my immediate family, so I know people who are very, very committed and earnest in their study of the natural world. And actually, it's been interesting to me. And as I said earlier, I was fascinated by this library of field recordings, which is amazing. These libraries, the most famous one is Cornell University in the US, which is, I think the whole thing is online. It's amazing. And so, yeah, so there's a whole field of study there, which is super interesting. When we had to, as I said, we had to get a naturalist to identify all the animals in the film and the birds in the film. That was also an interesting series of discussions around them. And I did a publication at the time that the work was first made. With one of the co-commissioners was the Mead Gallery in Coventry in the university there, and they published a very nice small book that about the project. And there's a lot of still images in the book. The book has tons and tons of still images. It's a little bit like designed a little bit like a bird watcher's book, like an old-fashioned bird watcher's book that would have a lot of images in it. So we took grabs from the film of all the different species that are depicted in the film and placed them through the book in this kind of bird watchery way, but they all had to be identified, with the Latin names, etc., etc. And it was a super interesting and enjoyable process. And you realize that this is such a kind of a fascinating niche area. And Yeah, so I likewise appreciate that history. As I say, the original manifestation of the diorama was from the 1890s. Sweden is a country that it's often difficult to appreciate when you're in like southern England or here in Dublin where I am, that Sweden is a very big country that actually has a huge area of like wilderness, whatever about its current conditions with global warming. It's a country that has a lot of hunters, a lot of hunting, a lot of taxidermy. It's a very much part of the kind of cultural history there. A little bit like you go to Scotland, there's actually a lot of wilderness here, and Sweden is very much like that, um, and also it's part of the lore of the place, and I value that.
Um, if anybody who hasn't seen the book that Gerard described a moment ago, I'd really recommend it. Whether you have seen the film or not, it includes a kind of transcription of the soundtrack, which is completely fascinating in terms of the kind of how you
The
phonetically
phonetics.
get across the sounds of these birds. And suggests that actually there is a kind of dialogue at work. There's a kind of script in
Hmm.
this book.
Hmm. Hmm.
Thank you so much, Gerard. I think that's our
Thanks, Brian.
hour up. And thanks to everybody for being here and for some really, really probing, fascinating, and learned questions. So thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.
I'd just like to echo both Brian and Gerard have been saying thank you to everyone for joining us this evening and for some great questions. And of course, thanks to Brian and Gerard for some really insightful conversation. And thank you to Samaya for providing the BSL for this talk. Great. Thank you so much, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye
Thank
bye,
you.
everybody.